Warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime for this Good Money Week event hosted by Just Money Movement. For those of you who don't know us, Just Money Movement is a Christian charity working towards a world where banks, businesses and the tax system help create a greener, fairer future for everyone. I'm Rosie Werner and I lead on our programme of work that equips Christians to explore ethical issues around money that we steward as individuals and as churches. And as I said, it's Good Money Week this week, led by our friends at UK SIF. Good Money Week brings together people and organisations who are passionate about how money can be used for good. And we're really pleased to have launched this year for the first time Good Money Sunday, coming up this Sunday, the 8th of October, to encourage more churches to pray, to reflect, to act on using money for good. So earlier this year, when we learned about a piece of work that Theos and Christian Aid were working on together around the theology of investment, we thought that would be a really pertinent topic to explore during Good Money Week. That would be of interest not to just to those of you who are involved in Just Money Movement, but to a wider audience too. So welcome to all of you, wherever you're joining us from. And a special welcome to friends from Theos and Christian Aid. Just Money Movement is proud to be a Christian Aid partner, and we work together on tax justice issues and wider campaigns around economic and climate justice. So to help us begin to explore a theological perspective on investment, we are delighted to have with us Madeleine Pennington and Paul Bickley from Theos, and Bob Kikuyu and Ollie Pearce from Christian Aid. And I say begin to explore because it's a huge topic and we're only going to scratch the surface of it today. But I hope that this time together will start us thinking a little about the biblical principles that we can draw on to guide our understanding of investments, to begin to think about what might shape a distinctly Christian approach to investing, and to explore what investing for the common good, for the good of all God's creation, might actually look like in practice. So I'm going to hand over first to Madeleine and to Paul from Theos to talk through a paper that they've been working on, and then to Bob, Christian Aid's Global Theology Advisor, joining us from Kenya. And then we'll have some time together for reflections and questions based on what you've heard. And if you do have any questions as we go along, as you hear the speakers, please put those questions in the chat and then we can come to those at the end. But yeah, I'll hand now to Maddie and to Paul to explain a little bit about the context of the work that they've been doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. So I think it's me first, and then I'll hand over to Paul. So the research that Theos did was in partnership with Christian Aid, and it emerged out of a sense from both organisations that basically the private sector has a sort of bad reputation, basically, that the good that it could do is not properly explored, and that particularly socially conscious Christians maybe see it as sort of the mental images of an already wealthy person who's gambling with somebody else's money, particularly in investment. That's the kind of the worst case scenario, to the detriment of the vulnerable. And actually that charity or even the public sector are sort of the nobler parts, really. And now that obviously is a fair critique at some level, so some investment is like that, but it's also an incomplete picture, both morally and in terms of the ways in which investment affects our lives. So increasing numbers of us obviously have money in pensions, and also even if you leave money just in a bank account, then the bank is investing that on your behalf. So there's a wider a broader hinterland of issues around investment. That's why we got involved with this area. And of course, investment is not always just financial. So the Bank of England defines investment as, quote, spending that has the potential to expand the capacity of the economy by adding to capital, knowledge and technology. So that can include investment that is expecting either a non-financial return or is investing something fundamentally non-financial, with the expectation that there will be some return of some kind or another. So Christians in particular need to ask about sort of what ways investment can be aligned with our faith for the common good, and some of the ways that investment currently functions in our economy are clearly to the social ill, but not all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the theological principles we've worked on here, and then I'm going to hand over to Paul. And basically we from our reading of the Bible, we've sort of uncovered 3 principles which we think give a sort of guardrail to think about investment, and then we need to obviously apply those practically, so Paul will take that bit. But those 3 principles are, firstly, the principle of stewardship. So that would be that there is no neutral option, that all resources are God's, not ours, and we're called to steward them well. So they should be used for God's purposes, and we should be seeking out ways to engage with the world rather than withhold from it. Secondly, the principle of just distribution, or perhaps limit, so that there's it's not that the Bible is against wealth per se, but there's more of a if you can call it a biblical bias against the concentration of wealth, and there are structural mechanisms by which that is reset. And then thirdly, the principle of risk, which is that we shouldn't be overly cautious or overly risk-taking, but that we invest as if God exists and there's a providential order there. So I'm going to go through those 3 principles in some slides, and then I'll hand over to Paul. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully, okay, so here it is. So the first principle then, I hope people can see this, is the principle of stewardship. Well, my face might be in the way of some of this. So firstly then, there is no neutral option when it comes to how we spend money. Once we have our immediate need taken care of, we can either store the rest, we can just keep it, and actually even putting it in a bank account isn't true storage. You'd maybe keep some gold under the mattress or something in order to really withhold it from anything else. You can either spend it on more things than just the basics. You can give it away, and then somebody else needs to decide what to do with it, or you can invest it. And each of those comes with its own moral challenges. So even gift, which might seem the most straightforward, can often, for example, create a power dynamic between people where one is the giver and one is the recipient. The Bible has language for the idea that there's no neutral option, and we call that the language of stewardship. So in Genesis, everything we receive comes ultimately from God, and we're created for relationship, not just with each other, but with the whole creation. And within that, we have a special responsibility for creation's well-being. Fundamentally, and at the core of our being, we're not the sort of economic man who just simply acts in his self-interest, and it is his, but that we all are fundamentally caretakers, and therefore we're called to participate in creation, not withhold ourselves or our resources from it. We've got some examples of how that same view pops up throughout Scripture. John 3:27, a man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven. Leviticus, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. So this first principle basically is, there is no way of withholding ourselves from the kind of moral quagmire that is the economy. Like everything we do is going to have an implication. Excessive consumption is bad, hoarding is bad, but also so is withdrawing it. And investment can be one of the ways in which we use our money, alongside other ways that can release the potential of relationships or new possibilities within the economy. Secondly, the principle of just distribution. So God is a God of liberation. The Bible is clear that God is on the side of the poor, and that Jesus is constantly concerned for the poor. So when he announces his ministry in the synagogue, he says, he describes that in terms of the Jubilee year. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." And biblical economic justice is structural as well as personal. So the Jubilee causes a reset. And I think what we've drawn from that is that basically in a modern sense, when it's applied to investment, everybody needs to have a continued stake in the source of their prosperity. So for the biblical authors, that was the land, and they were an agrarian society. But how can investment be such that it's releasing everybody to still have that, I suppose, connection to the source of prosperity. That means that money, wealth itself is not as such the focus of biblical critique, but it often can be, and that is where it is enjoyed for its own sake, rather than being submitted to the love of God and each other more widely, or when it's used in a way that doesn't serve that network of relationships well. So it fundamentally undermines our created essence, I suppose, as caretakers and stewards of resources. So this is the second principle. And then thirdly, on risk. So I mentioned in the introduction that there is this idea of the kind of someone risking other people's money and simply gambling. The other extreme to that is simply being cautious and safe with your money. And we think that the Bible goes somewhere between those two risks, which is that we are affirming God's providence, and the Israelites are told never to store more than a day's worth of food in the wilderness. Alternatively, there's give us this day our daily bread. There's this sense of trust that it will be okay. So we don't need to store up money for a rainy day as much as finding where we can put that money to work. The one use of that's sometimes translated invest in the Bible is Ecclesiastes 11:2. Invest in 7 ventures. Yes, in 8, you don't know what disaster may come upon the land. But sometimes invest, that word is also translated as divide. So it's sort of looking for opportunities and yes, being prudent, but not just prudent. The parable of the 10 minas, again, is that sense of the servants who just sit on the money and not the ones that are in favour. We're expected to put our money to work. So there's a sense of good and bad risk there. Often in what behaviour we might see as risky, people are taking on somebody else's risk. They might be investing money that isn't theirs. And that is clearly not towards the common good, but as a different kind of investment, which I suppose throws widely your resources in the hope that they can be used and unlock potential. So those are our 3 theological principles. I'm going to hand over to Paul now, who is going to outline some of the ways that they can be applied in practice.
Thank you so much, Maddie. I'm really pleased to be here, and I know that we're both grateful and collectively grateful at Theos for our partnership with Christian Aid and the opportunity to work on these issues. So yes, getting steadily more applied, or beginning to bring these things into a more practical application. How do we take those theological rails and begin to work down them? So I want to first say that we tend, when thinking about investment, to apply ourselves just to the question of the subject of investment. So Maddie, I wonder if you could show the next slide. But we want to, what are we investing in? Is it a good company with good practices, good practices which are good for the environment or for workers, or so on and so forth? And that's an excellent question to ask. We'll get onto that. But we want to advocate that there are 2 other things that we need to hold in tension with that as we move towards a Christian practice of investment. And those are the goal of investment and the limits of investment. So let me briefly run through these 3 things: the goal of investment, the subject of investment, and the limit of investment. So the goal of investment, I mean, basically, the name of the game here is to move towards an integrated view of value. So in secular terms, according to, as it were, the normal, in inverted commas, economic view, the aim of investment is merely to allocate resources in a way that can ensure a financial return. There is, of course, a subcategory of social investment in this model, but we must go further, we say, and recognize that, in fact, all investing is on some level social investing. Why? Because it has a social and relational, it has a public effect beyond the merely economic. So over and above the bare minimum, that we tend to go to the bare minimum of do no harm. With as you invest your money, do no harm. Don't invest in a tobacco company or an arms manufacturer. But we need to move beyond that to one where we integrate a view of social value with economic value. So Christians should uncover possibilities for investment which actively promote a clear social good, not just avoid doing social evil. The challenge is to encourage investors to adopt an integrated view of social value, which refuses to separate profitability from the need to sustain people and planet. And after all, ultimately, objectively, these aren't separable. We can make short-term profit, but only to long-term detriment if we don't take care of people and planet. So, of course, we see in the sort of investment ecology, different ways of approaching investment, more sophisticated frameworks for judging value, which do help us in this respect. But at the end of the day, we want to suggest that this is a moral and a spiritual issue. Anyone making an investment is making a moral decision. And the question is, what do you want? Do you really want to promote social good, or do you really want to promote an economic return? And there is, of course, all kinds of implications in terms of what the Bible might teach us about what we should desire, and what would be what's the good we should be searching for. So the question is, what do you want? Do you have an integrated view of social value or a disintegrated view of social and economic value? So we need to hold that first and foremost in our minds. Then we can talk about the subject of investment. And of course, we could approach this in different ways. Others have talked about the avoid, engage, embrace model, where we think that there are some investments that we actively need to avoid, the sin stocks, if we like, of gambling, alcohol, and pornography. And investment advisors might talk about applying a negative screen to avoid arms or fossil fuel companies. And there might be a case also for steering against large tech companies for other reasons. Financial institutions themselves are interesting because, of course, sometimes they might support work or an industry or the development of the economy which is negative. I know that Christian Aid have done some work around this and drew attention to the fact that HSBC will continue to allow investment in coal infrastructure in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Indonesia. So there are those avoid cases which are relatively clear. There are then at the other end of the spectrum, and Maddie, I think we have some slides on this which you can just kind of circle through as I talk. At the other end is the embrace, the one where there's a clear social good that we can say, I affirm this is absolutely right. Of course, there is a trade-off, and here we need to go back to the goal. There is sometimes a trade-off between the clear social good and the amount of profitability, and we need to decide exactly where we're going to land on that. But in between those two extremes, there are a whole lot of judgments to make, and that's where we talk about engage, where we talk about understanding what our ability is to influence a particular company's corporate policy. Do we have any at all, or might we have some in collaboration with others? So there's a whole lot of I suppose quite nuanced judgments to be made in the middle between those stocks or investments that we think, well, that's obviously wrong, and at the other end, obviously right. In the middle space, we spend our time thinking, gathering information, understanding a company's behavior, its policy and approach, and then possibly engaging with it. And of course, as we talk to people around this, talk to people in the investment world about this, they would often say, there's a difficult decision to be made. Do we disinvest and therefore lose our voice? Or do we stay in and continue to try and influence the policy of the company in question? The point is that not to say that there is always a right or clear judgment, but that judgment must be made and actively kind of ethically explored. And that's a combination of all sorts of things, including a proper understanding of what a company is doing. Of course, many of us are just a little bit lazy when it comes to our investments. We might look at the headlines, we might look at the kind of immediately available information, but there might be more that we could find. And there are all sorts of organizations that help us do that. So avoid, engage, embrace. That's a useful and quite common way of thinking about investments. But I think the emphasis will always be in the middle space, all those companies which are neither purely good nor purely evil. We just must understand and do the hard work of informed ethical judgments. Then just to conclude with understanding the limits of investment. I think we wanted to embark on this piece of work with Christian Aid because we think that there is in the investment world a real mechanism to leverage positive change for the common good, but it's not totally we're not totally free to do that. There are limits to what we can do. So I don't know who's on this call. Some of you probably relatively modest shareholders in quite large companies. And the task there is to understand what agency you have and understand how you can engage with what opportunities do you have to work either as an individual or in collaboration with others to exercise an influence on the company in question. It varies, and of course, it's not always made easy. Thinking about tech companies, a colleague to me pointed out recently that lots of tech companies have multiple classes of share, so that you might buy into, I don't want to mention names, but you might buy into a particular tech company and think, oh, well, maybe I can kind of draw it or participate in some way, draw it in a kind of more positive direction. We have to have quite a new understanding of what we're actually doing. Is this a share class which has any shareholder rights or any shareholder voting rights? Will I get to go to an AGM? There have, of course, been instances of real positive social change that has come about through the work of share action, and even on a more local level through people like Citizens UK, who use share ownership as a way to get into a shareholder meeting at HSBC, and that resulted in a living wage being paid to cleaners in the start of the living wage campaign. So there are real opportunities there, but there are limits. We think there might be an analogy there. I think there is an analogy there with our kind of citizenship, with our rights as voting members of the public. Most of us are realistic about what we can achieve as a single individual. We know that our vote is one among millions, that sometimes it's very unlikely that we'll have any impact, but there are opportunities for engagement. And there will, in some other instances, people will work quite hard if you're a member of a marginal constituency to get your vote and to talk to you and to listen to you. So in the same way that the political democratic process throws up opportunities, there is an analogy there with the corporate world. But we need to understand, and also another analogy there is we often need to work in collaboration with others. So who else is there out there? The Just Money movement, Christian Aid, Share Action, others who will help us achieve positive goals. We did, as part of this work, just want to offer some positive, concrete examples of people who we saw doing this kind of what we came to call informally common good investment. It's easier to point to the examples of people who are breaking the rules, doing damage, and it's right to campaign against them and to draw attention, but we wanted to gather some information on people who are doing more positive work. I need to very strong disclaimer here. This is not investment advice, nor am I advertising. I have no paid partnership with the people I'm about to mention, but I do think they're a good example of somebody who's doing something different. So let me tell you about Resonance, who are a social impact property fund manager based in the UK. It pools investments from a variety of sources into multiple funds, and these funds are invested with social enterprises, often those working around housing. Their goal is to connect profit to purpose. They have that integrated view of social value and create pathways to funding for organizations working to resolve significant social challenges. So at the time of writing, at the time of our meeting today, they have about £350 million under investment. It's built on a critique of the outcomes of profit-motivated corporate behavior, which is fixated on last quarter performance. But they are doing something different in, of course, a sector which is beset by all sorts of social and political problems. So they also have a critique, by the way, of the kind of grant-driven charity system. So they're trying to use investment to sort of leverage funding into the charity sector as well. So they have a number of funds. One in particular is very interesting. It attempts to buy housing up for vulnerable women. So they work with charities. They would use their fund. They would buy housing. They would renew it, and then they would with that charity, that housing will be used to house vulnerable women and vulnerable families. So but they do produce a return on capital. They have, again, it's an integrated view of investment. It isn't saying that profit is wrong. It is saying rather that there are multiple things that we can achieve at the same time. They accept that there is risk here, but they talk about the desire to illuminate rather than to eliminate risks. So they want their shareholders, their investors, to understand what the risks are. They're honest about them, but they invite them in with an offer of there is some profit to be made here, but there is also a profound social good. It's worth saying, just in closing, this might be a sort of slightly negative point at which to finish, but they would say that there are, in spite of the fact that they do manage relatively large amounts of capital, there are systemic barriers for them to their work. The regulatory environment seeks to protect investors from themselves, and they push them away from private investments, like resonance would count as a private investment, towards stock markets and traded funds, where we have a lot. We by definition, you're a lot further from the outcomes of your investment. So it seems to me that there is some work to do around that in terms of the framework in which we operate. All of us as individuals, when we have investment opportunities, do we have the freedom to actually, in our own under our own light, to pursue a social good that we see, or is the regulatory environment somehow gamed against that? Of course, it wants to protect people from risk, but we want to say ultimately that risk is part of our ecology, which people must be able to engage with positively. So I'll draw stumps there, just to reiterate, 3 things in tension: the goal of investment, that integrated view of social value, the subject of investment, which is of course a very important conversation, but then the limitations which we face.
Thank you so much, Paul and Maddie. Thank you for the depth of reflection that you bring to thinking around this topic. There's so much there for us to reflect on. And there was a comment in the chat about seeing one of the slides again, but I think we'll make sure we do that in the Q&A at the end, and hopefully can make those available to people who want to spend a bit more time exploring particularly that, and the avoid, embrace, engage spectrum, which I think is a really helpful framing. I'm going to ask Bob Cuckoo to speak for us now from Christian Aid, as the Global Theology Advisor for Christian Aid, just to help us, I guess, to join the dots a bit between this work that Theos has been doing, Christian Aid's interest in this topic, and how that relates to your work, Bob. So we're really, really grateful to have you with us, and I'll pass over to you now.
Great, thank you. And I'll try to catch up with the time over here. And I'll start off by just introducing myself, like has been said. I'm the Global Theology Advisor for the organization Christian Aid, and part of my role is to ensure that our policies, processes, and practices, and in a sense, some of the things that we support are aligned theologically, or should I say more specifically, biblically. Now, I have with me a jar of honey over here. And if I was to bring it closer, that's the name of the company. Can't see it as clearly, but it's called Nyuki Hubs Kenya Limited. And then if you were able to see, probably not, in the corner here is a small Christian Aid logo. Now, this jar of honey is from a social enterprise that Christian Aid has supported to start and continues to support together with others who have funded this enterprise. When I first joined Christian Aid about 7 years ago, my first project trip, was to a forest area, and I was able to meet a farmer, a beekeeper from a very marginalized area deep inside the forest, never really associated with other people as a tribe and as a community, which is why they isolated themselves in the forest. And really all they could do was keep bees for their livelihood, not even just for their livelihood, but for food. And then they were also hunting the animals in the forest. So they were hunter-gatherers. But Christian Aid was able to find out a little bit more about these people and what they did, and began a project where they supported their beekeeping and then also connected them with people who helped them to buy their honey and therefore improved their livelihood. And when I went to visit the farmer out there in the forest, he spoke very proudly about how his life had changed, how he was able to build a much better house. He was now keeping cows and was able to get milk and sustenance from the milk. Their diet had improved. His daughter had not just gone through to school, but was now in the university. And by that very process, from the proceeds from his beekeeping and the support of Christian Aid, he was able to change his life and break the cycle of poverty, which was common amongst that group of people. Fast forward a couple of years later now, Christian Aid was able to get some people to fund some of that in a social enterprise, begin Nuki Hubs, which is this company. And now what I saw with that farmer in the forest has been replicated to many, many hubs around the country that Christian Aid and the enterprise it has started, Nuki Hubs, that it now supports. And this, for me, is a fantastic illustration of the direction that Christian Aid wants to go and wants to see in the area of investments and the use of our wealth and our resources in a social enterprise, in an area that supports not just person to make profit, but many other people for their lives to be changed, as I saw illustrated with that beekeeper up in that farm. But just to add on through the theological premises that have been shared by my colleagues at Theos, two that I want to add on top of those, which in a sense support very much what they have said. The first one is that a seed must be sown into good ground. And drawing from a parallel with the parable of the good sower and the seeds which fell on different soils, we are convinced and in fact actively support seeds that are grown, are sown in good soil. But also, we challenge those soils that are not grown in good soils. The different kinds of soils have been there. And, remember from the parable, seeds that were on a rock, seeds that were eaten up by birds, seeds that were choked by the weeds, and then the seeds that are in good soil. We have found and we have challenged seeds that do not grow in good soil in our programmatic work. And most recently, Christian Aid's decision to withdraw our banking services with a certain bank that was slow in withdrawing its support from divesting or moving away from investing in fossil fuels. And Christian Aid was able to analyze the banks that were able to do this, and we were very clear just a few weeks ago to pull out from a certain bank, and we're in the process of withdrawing from that particular bank to another bank that has very clearly made a choice to invest in what we consider to be the good kind of soil. And so you see, it's not just what people do, but also what people do not do. And I guess it's pretty much also the Ephesians process over here, where in the book of Ephesians, do not lie, do not steal, do not do this, but instead do this, act in love and behave in a particular way. We do that in the same process at Christian Aid. When people do not do the things that we feel are right in terms of their investments, we challenge them. And we do not just challenge them, but where we are invested, we pull out and withdraw our investment and send our investments to places or support people who invest in the right kind of way. Not only that, we have supported recently advocacy movements against those banks, and we have the Just Love movement, which is recently, if you notice recently in the UK, particularly in London, has been pressurizing the top churches in the UK, top churches in London, to remove their investment from those banks that are still investing in fossil fuels and move them to banks that do not support fossil fuel investments, but also put their investments in social enterprises and in good places. Now, the intention there was to get them to recognize that the investments were not made in good soil. Soil that produces elements that choke others, if I may use a word, soil that produces invasive species. But the second theological orientation we have is sound biblical investments recognize God's priorities. Most investments recognize opportunities, and that's what good investments really are about, and they seize the moment. But this, for us, is a call to recognize that it is more than just making the right call at the right time, and instead recognize where God is at work and join him there. John 5:17, Jesus says, "My Father is at work, and up till now, I too am working." We want to ask, where is God at work? Where is he doing something significant through individuals, through people? And there, in a sense, is where we want our investments to go, or those are the investments that we want to support, because we see investments as part of our mission. Right now, there is an existential threat around the climate crisis, an area for which we have long been as a church either ignorant or apathetic, or both. Our investments need to partner with God in expressing, as my colleagues from Theos have said, a care for creation, or at the very least, avoiding the destruction of creation. But second, our investments need to recognize the dignity of humans as made in the image of God. And we ask and we constantly challenge, what kind of investment enhance that dignity, restore that dignity where it has been taken away, or challenge where the dignity of people is undermined? And for us, Nuki Hubs, the company, social investment that Christian Aid has supported, and where we have other partners coming in, we have charities that have supported this, and we have trusts that have supported Nuki Hubs. Yes, this is a good example. And as I've listened to Nuki Hubs and seen their work, quality of the product and a fair wage for the farmer have been very, very key for us in that direction. And this company has provided good balance for us in that to happen. But where does this lead us to, and particularly we in Christian Aid? A few years ago, Christian Aid decided or saw the need to join a growing body of Christian thinkers and investors in stepping back to question some of the fundamental assumptions of today's dominant economic narratives. In that report, authored by, among others, my colleague Ollie Pierce, who's coming after me, they posited in The Unquenchable Thirst for Growth that a truly good life cannot only, or even at all, be counted in goods or wealth. People should never be reduced to mere instruments of an economic system. By asking the question, what enables truly human life? Oli and others suggested that the economy or wealth be seen as a tool to facilitate human and planetary flourishing. That our economic system should be judged by its potential for sustaining life, both of people and planet, in ways that support the common good. And in looking for new expressions of economic life, they made the radical suggestion that it could be time, maybe really is time, to abandon the goal of endless growth and increasing consumption, at least for those who are already prosperous by global standards, and seek to be more just and efficient at sharing existing resources and wealth. To this end, they turned to what I call the hallmarks of a good economic system, which were defined by Archbishop Justin Welby in his speech to the All-Party Parliamentary Group 39 on inclusive growth as 1, creative, 2nd, gratuity, 3rd, solidarity and subsidiarity, using language echoing that of a Catholic social teaching. Gratuity, he defines as the generosity that does not seek always to make the highest possible return in every circumstance, but which recognizes that there are values more fundamental than profit. In solidarity and subsidiarity, there are means by which he suggests the risks of creativity are managed so that no one is left out or left behind, and everyone at the lowest level possible has a role to play. Christian Aid's inclusive market development work or program, which works alongside the private sector to help people out of poverty, pays significance to this or recognizes this. Our aim is to impact poverty through inclusive business practice and the creation of enterprising local markets. And these projects, which often would not have happened left to market forces alone, contribute to economic growth, though it's not their primary aim. And these projects are partially an outcome of that theological thinking and reflection. Thank you